everybody. Hello. Hello, everybody. So my name's Melissa Leach, and I'm the director here at IDS, and I'd like to offer a really warm welcome to our in-person audience and our very large online audience to our first major event of the year. This event called Recasting Development in 2023. Is this going to be a year when we're going to make really big progress on development, or is there going to be continuation of the kind of faltering we've seen over the last while with its aid cuts and many other disasters? What are the current dilemmas facing the development community, and maybe what are the sources for hope and causes for optimism? It's a key time, I think, to be asking questions of this sort, not just because it's the beginning of the year, but given some observations about the moment we're in, the world we're in. It's a moment of multiple intersecting crises. We're going to hear this evening about the challenges in particular sectors, but also many of the cross-cutting ones and the interactions between them. I think it's also key to remember that these are affecting everybody everywhere, albeit in a diversity of ways, but really emphasizing the renewed importance of development as global, as universal, important here in the UK as it is elsewhere. It's also the year of the SDG summit, halfway towards the 2030 goals. And the world is way off track as to where it should be at that moment. The SDGs, of course, recognize that universalism, but I think we might want to be asking whether wealthy countries will really be taking their responsibilities seriously, and whether there's a risk of silos that are going to underplay these crosscuts in a world of shared global challenges. I think it's also a moment when we're seeing current trends like those we'll be hearing about this evening, catalyzing and intensifying some further dynamics, those between migration on the one hand and border closures on the other, those between resistance to change and authoritarian clampdowns and backlashes on it, digital opportunities, but also digital disruptions and surveillance, and others. And it's really not clear how those are going to play out. So this all makes the current context, the current moments and the next year look highly uncertain. So in addition to offering maybe some predictions about the year ahead, where we can, we might look to our speakers and to all of you in the discussion to consider how development can really support the kind of transformative change towards reduced poverty, greater justice, reduced impact on the environment in a world in which uncertainty is the new normal. So I'm delighted that we've got a fantastic panel today to help us consider these questions, and I'll introduce them briefly now in the order in which they'll speak. So talking about reducing extreme inequities, we have Vidya Diwakar, who's a fellow and deputy director of the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network here at IDS. We have, talking about authoritarianism and democracy, Shandana Mohmand, who is a research fellow and the leader of our governance cluster. We'll then be turning to talk about capitalism and its future and market-based solutions to Anabel Marin, who is a fellow and leader of our business markets and the state cluster. We'll then turn online to Hayley MacGregor, a fellow and until recently leader of the health and nutrition cluster, to talk about fostering healthy lives. And last but not least, to talk about climate and environmental justice, Shilpi Srivastava, who's a fellow in our resource politics and environmental change cluster. And then we'll look to Peter Taylor, who's our director of research, to provide some cross-cutting discussants comments. And then we will open up to Q&A and comments and thoughts from all of you, both in the room and online. And I'd like to ask our online audience, please, to post your questions in the chat, and you can do so throughout the talks, and we'll come to them when we come to the Q&A section. So without further ado, let me hand over to Vidya to start us off. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa. As Melissa noted, we're now at the halfway point of the SDGs, 8 years in, 8 years out. Given our current state of affairs, this requires accelerating action and driving transformation, especially amongst furthest behind groups and areas if we have any hopes of making progress towards global commitments. Yet, as this figure indicates, poverty just before the pandemic and likely during it was concentrated primarily in certain low and lower middle income countries in the top right of this quadrant, which also continue to experience a high prevalence of conflict-related fatalities and high numbers of those of populations affected by disasters. This convergence then of poverty and crises means that it's critical that responding to poverty eradication and reducing extreme inequities in that process is at its core both sensitive to working amidst polycrisis and also proactive in its response to these crises as well. In other words, we need to be working both in and on crises in the road to zero poverty and reduced extreme inequities. This isn't just a concern, however, between countries. The challenge we're increasingly facing in many parts of the world is that inequalities within countries are also worsening. So for example, while we previously and continue to discuss intersecting inequalities primarily along identity markers such as gender, caste, and so forth, we need to increasingly be aware of inequalities of people and place, of access to resources and historic marginalization that combine to reinforce extreme inequities, aggravated in many cases by inadequate policy responses to mitigate their negative effects. So to give some examples of these links in some of our work in the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network, in recent research in Afghanistan, for example, we saw that the pandemic, of course, was sequenced then with the transition in power on the back of droughts, economic crises, and so forth, contributing to a crisis of multiple dimensions that was especially worrying for certain groups, not least women and girls, and also contributing in turn to increasing levels of hunger dramatically. In Nigeria, we see from quantitative analysis of phone surveys, which itself have its limitations in addressing, in understanding the well-being of the populations at the bottom welfare quintiles who might not necessarily have adequate access to phone ownership to participate in these surveys. But we see nevertheless from these surveys that people already in poverty, representing the bottom two welfare quintiles pre-pandemic, experienced a confluence of challenges over the last 3 years. So for example, on the one hand, they were more likely to draw down on assets in response to negative shocks, as this figure on the right shows. In addition, people in the bottom two wealth quintiles were more regularly forced to spend more on fuel over the last year during the economic crises when compared to other groups. And in addition, people in the bottom two quintiles were also likely to have lower expectations for their ability to manage future climate-related crises. All of this then in turn suggests that the response cannot just be a question of reducing inequalities of income. It isn't also just about poverty, but rather it's equally about conceptions of human security, of access to services, and so forth, all underpinned by notions of justice and supporting governance arrangements central to conceptions of equity. And more so that these conditions of polycrisis, while represented here in examples in Afghanistan and Nigeria, are by no means evidenced only in contexts that are typically prevalent on, say, lists of state fragility and so forth. We see quite similar findings where people in and near poverty have experienced particularly negative hardships and reductions in income in other contexts such as Cambodia, Nepal, and various other countries as well. So what this means in turn then is that we need to find ways of addressing multiple crises simultaneously rather than one at a time, and moreover in centering equity in this response. This in turn requires a shift from single issue technocratic approaches that were largely used to tackle the pandemic And the complex nature of these crises in turn means that policymakers instead need to develop longer-term solutions rather than firefighting crises as they emerge. The question then, of course, becomes how can this be done? On some level, this necessitates matrix thinking, revisiting and recasting what we know of complexity, of intersectionality. And there are various examples of this, of positive examples in these areas we can draw on, especially through localized decision-making, relying on the knowledge that local communities, local disaster risk management agencies and so forth have about the populations in the areas in which they operate. And in addition, from our standpoint, we attempt also to start this journey and provide policy guidance and recommendations to equitable crisis responses in our forthcoming chronic poverty report on pandemic recovery, expected in April this year. The report itself will provide suggestions on how to mitigate some of the socioeconomic effects of one crisis, of COVID-19, on people in and near poverty in the road to recovery. But it will also more broadly discuss how to address polycrisis, cutting alongside various dimensions of equity as discussed earlier, recognizing that these dimensions intersect across identity, time, and place. Their challenges intersect, and so we need to intersect and layer our responses in reducing extreme inequities and charting a pathway to zero poverty amidst contexts of uncertainty. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. So, Shandana.
One of those many crises that the world has become more aware of in these last many years, of course, is that of authoritarianism, of growing authoritarianism and diminishing democracy. And this is a point in history where we did not expect to find ourselves, especially at the turn of this century. And so what we have in 2023, 2023 is going to be a year that's going to follow 16 straight years in which more countries have now autocratized than those that have democratized. Democracy, of course, is a large concept. So we look at what exactly we mean by this trend of autocratization. But as Melissa said right at the beginning, what's really important here to understand is that this is not something that affects a particular part of the world. This is something that we're seeing in different parts of the world. And as one of those crises that really holds different parts of the world together, this is a collective challenge that we're now facing across all parts. 70% of the world's population, according to the Varieties of Democracy dataset, now live in some variety of an autocracy. That's an astonishing figure, and that's really a sobering challenge before us as we enter this new yet one more year of these kinds of stats before us. These numbers, of course, come from the sorts of reversals that we saw over the last decade in large countries such as Brazil and in India, established democracies that went in the other direction, and of course in the US. So this figure has to do with these very large countries. But it's not just them, it's also happening in the heart of Europe. And that's really where the challenge becomes larger for us. And by that, I mean countries such as Hungary and Poland and Croatia and Serbia and Slovenia and the Czech Republic, all of which are now autocratizing in some way or another. Of course, the big question for us then is to try and figure out where this is happening. And that's really what we need to be able to recognize more of as we look at these trends around us. Again, borrowing from the Varieties of Democracy dataset, when we think of democracy, it's usually along two dimensions, that of civil liberties and that of competitive politics. And it's on civil liberties that we see the greatest regression around the world right now. But what I particularly want, and so this relates to a lot of work that we've been doing at IDS around closing civic spaces. Right up on top, almost all of those top few indicators have centrally to do with that work that we've been looking at within a number of programs at IDS that have thought about what it means for our spaces for research to be diminishing, but also spaces for associational politics and spaces for expression. But what I really wanted to point out in that diagram, in that graph as well, is the freedom of discussion for women. And this is something we've been realizing as well, is in some ways, autocratization seems to target women's groups in particular. So there's two very large programs at IDS that look centrally at this, that look at the backlash, the increasingly rigorous backlash that faces women's associational groups in particular. You'd ask, why is any of this happening? We have a few reasons, but this is very much an explanation that we all need to collectively find across all of our work. Connecting to what we just heard from Vidya, a lot of this really starts around the period of the 2008 economic crisis and has continued possibly because of the fact that our economic crises are multiplying and have continued as well. Those of you in countries such as India or Nigeria will understand the notion of nationalist populism. Even in the UK, the polarization that happened around the Brexit vote, for example, all of that language that you have of enemies of the state that lie outside and anything you might have to say about regimes being making you anti-national in some way or another. All of this, of course, works through disinformation and the rise of social media. That's another reason that we've been becoming more and more aware of. And of course, on that as well, IDS has a lot of work in on digital technology and what the impact of that has been. But there's a real connection between that and these trends that we're now seeing. And leading into the other comments that you're going to get slightly later on is also the impact of COVID-19 and all of the measures that were used during that time that were required for a health crisis that then also ended up drawing, restricting civil liberties and associational politics in other ways as well, long after long after they might have been needed. So moving forward and trying to sort of find the positive in all of this, there are reasons. We understand that people are voting for autocracies, that our autocracies are not largely military coups. Having said that, there were 5 military coups just in the last 1 year. So clearly there is quite a shift that's happening in our politics. But what we need to understand is, why are people voting for these regimes? Because a lot of this autocratization is happening through electoral politics. And what are the ways in which our associational politics may not be connecting or may not be strengthening democracy? So how do we counter this? How do we counter this at the local level? How do we learn from the reversal, from the move back to democracy that we saw in the Brazilian election very recently, or in the US election before that? What is the type of organizing that happened at the local level that might really give us excellent ways of understanding what are the ways that we can push back against this kind of growing autocracy? And also for us, for those of us that study democracy, for those of us that study governance, to understand how our politics and our governance is being changed by autocrats in power. Not through dramatic coups, but again, from inside the system, through constitutional reforms, through the narratives that are used, through the ways that bureaucracies are functioning or are shaped. And so, and how do we recognize that this form of politics? And that's something clearly we're focusing on. But a few key events to look forward to look at in 2023. There's a few important elections coming up. To quote the Washington Post on this, the largest is going to be in Nigeria. Now, after the loudest is going to be in Pakistan in October, simply because of how polarized that country is. But the most important is going to be in June in Turkey. And this is going to tell us whether we're able to move, whether we see the end of Erdogan's 20 years in power. And an important thing to keep in mind there is that it's not just about dealing with autocrats continuing in power, but also thinking about the narratives that they've managed to create and the ways in which we can then move against that. So a little bit of hope in Turkey right now, leading up to that election, is the coalitional politics that has formed on the other side to try and create a credible opposition, a viable opposition to Erdogan. And within that, the excitement that is being created around the current mayor of Istanbul, who has a quite inclusive agenda, apparently, and quite in opposition to everything that we have heard of the exclusionary narrative that we have heard from Erdogan. So I'll stop there and move to the next talk.
Shandana, thank you. That's really lots to watch in quite a direct way coming up. So, Anabel, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so what is the response of capitalism or market-based solutions to these several crises from climate change, inequality, the pandemic, and so on? This is a very broad question, but I will try to focus and respond using one example, which is the example to the COVID crisis. So the questions are, is capitalism responding to this kind of crisis? In which ways are these responses enough, for whom, and so on? And with the example, what I want to illustrate is the fact that actually capitalism is responding, but mostly in ways that are for self-preserving, to reproduce the key elements that are instrumental for the system to keep on alive. So I'm talking about issues like exclusionary rights, property rights, and consumption. So, but let's go to the COVID example. In a record time, the system, what we saw as a response to the COVID is that in a record time, the system delivered a technological response, vaccines. And it was effective. We can say in some ways that it was effective, particularly for the reproduction of the system. But was it fair? Obviously, it wasn't fair. And was efficient in terms of the trade-offs between effectiveness and justice? Well, we don't know. And that's what I want to use and show you some of the facts. In response to the pandemic, in a very short period of time, we have hundreds of vaccine projects. Actually, in October of 2021, we have 322 vaccine projects all over the world. Around 40 countries have their own vaccine projects, and 30 of these projects were well advanced. So the relevant knowledge to face the pandemic, or the scientific knowledge, was there. And then we found out that actually the vaccines that were actually reached the market, they all were based on knowledge that was publicly funded. So the public good knowledge, in a way, was there. And we should be happy about that. But then in the same short period of time, we saw that in the name of the public interest, capitalist rules and institutions shaped by coalitions between governments from powerful countries and companies from these countries create artificially an oligopoly market, which based on favoring some of these companies, giving them the exclusive rights of exploitations of what it was before this public knowledge. So how this happened? Most of the attention went to patents, but actually there were other rules and instruments in the system that were very instrumental to this process. And here I'm talking about fast-tracking process of authorization of vaccines that were in powerful countries favor some projects over the other. We are talking about exclusive use of clinical trials. We are talking about rules of migration and so on. An important question, of course, is, were these selected projects the best? And the sad response is that we don't know, because how the system works is that it kills alternatives. It's all the way it works, that favors the first movers. And it makes very difficult for alternatives to then enter. And well, talking about the impacts, that's the next important question. What was the impact? Well, to begin with, of course, most of the people in the richer economies finally eventually got access to the vaccine. We know that the companies that were favored by the system earned millions of dollars. But sadly, most of the people in the poorer countries didn't access the vaccine. And not even the solidarity mechanisms that were created to attend the situation work. The COVAX actually didn't work, and it didn't stop deaths that were really unnecessary. But this is capitalism, and this is the main message that I want to give, that these millions of people that were left out unvaccinated, and the thousands of people that die actually were not a side effect of a good working system. They were fundamental for the operation of the system, because the companies that deliver the solutions has exclusionary rights to be able to deliver the solution, and that's the way they earn the millions that they earn. But one of the more worrying legacies of all these processes is that, in my view, is that the main tools and ideas that are behind all these processes remain untouched after the crisis. Ideas like the importance of property rights for incentivizing innovation and so on. And so, looking at the future and with some more positive things to look at, I think we can have hope, because we have been seeing for some years now the emergence of new movements and ideas which are based on different principles of cooperation rather than competition, collective agency, solidarity, and so on. But we should understand them much better, and we should be much more, understand even more what are the elements within the system that are making the emergence of these movements to expand. And I'm talking here about things like, as already mentioned, property rights and so on. But I want to mention, to finish, one thing that I think will connect with the next presentation by Hayley, which is discussions about preparedness for next pandemics, which are very much focusing on issues of open science and open knowledge and so on. And I'm worried about that because of the overemphasis that in these discussions we are giving on issues of cooperation and sharing research and knowledge, when the problem that we observed actually during the COVID pandemic was not about the lack of cooperation around knowledge, as I said before. It was much more about how capitalist institutions actually allowed a few companies to capture most of the benefits of what was before public knowledge. So what I will actually advocate for is for open and collaboration and collaborative approaches to issues like rule settings, like data and information about clinical trials, and so on, all things that are necessary for companies to then capture markets, because knowledge actually is quite still an open and cooperative process, the production of knowledge. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So in quite a nice segue, I'm going to turn now to Hayley, who's there online, to talk about fostering healthy lives, also in the wake of the pandemic.
Good afternoon. So I'm sure you're all aware, global health has been dominated these past 3 years by the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, its shockwaves continue to reverberate beyond health, as we've been hearing. And the experience has undoubtedly shaken global health. And significantly, it's a reality that the pre-pandemic indices ranking certain high-income countries as best prepared for an outbreak were proven wholly inaccurate, not least because they didn't take account of factors such as political leadership and trust in public authorities. And IDS research provided evidence of the wide-ranging effects of COVID on lives and livelihoods, effects both of the disease experience, but also of the public health measures and their means of enforcement. And the pandemic, of course, unfolded very differently in different social, demographic, and political economic contexts. For example, ethnographic findings from our pandemic preparedness project showed how people were navigating intersecting precarities which shaped experiences, as responses to the fear of an acute crisis were layered upon chronic challenges of ill health, as well as ongoing uncertainties, such as those caused by authoritarian regimes taking advantage of a discourse of health security to sanction violent lockdowns. This research has added weight to an argument that health emergencies are best understood not as isolated crises requiring siloed responses, but as events that are rooted in the dynamics of interconnected crises and slow emergencies related to climate, mobility, and wider development challenges. This past year has thus offered vital opportunities for further debate about the framing of mainstream epidemic preparedness, looking back 2022 saw a ramping up of an emphasis on technological interventions, such as vaccines and antiviral medicines. For example, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI, launched its 100-day mission, a vision to develop vaccines against emerging viruses at speed. The rapidity of technological innovation in response to the novel coronavirus has been noted as an extraordinary advance, and I too see the enormous value of new knowledge that can be harnessed in future. However, conventional approaches that focus exclusively on biomedical silver bullets now most definitively do not seem sufficient to contend with the more complex nature of health challenges. And as we approach the 3rd anniversary of the declaration of COVID-19 as a public health emergency of international concern, IDS will be launching a report funded by the COVID Collective, where we put forward our ideas for rethinking pandemic preparedness. We focus on the importance of longer-term investment in system strengthening, building the health of populations and community-led responses, an approach to preparedness that can also institute deliberative processes to draw upon a wider range of knowledge. At IDS, we have found it heartening to witness such thinking also gradually filtering into the mainstream of global health institutions. To reference the late Paul Farmer, who sadly passed away in this last year, countries need staff, and systems to adequately respond to health emergencies. And indeed, I would say to have any hope of meeting all the health-related SDGs. Now, the pandemic threw a stark spotlight on old problems, entrenched health inequities intermeshed with societal inequities, and vested commercial and political interests constraining possibilities for change, what Farmer called pathologies of power. Some of what played out was deeply dispiriting, such as the inability of existing global mechanisms to halt vaccine nationalism and ensure equitable distribution of scarce resources. And as we just heard from Anabel, even rapid technological advances or the celebration of scientific collaboration and open science mask darker sides, processes that require further scrutiny of murky relations of power and profit. With the declaration in June last year of mpox, monkeypox, as the next public health emergency, similar issues for justice have sadly arisen, related to uneven attention to epidemic and endemic diseases dependent on geographical hierarchies, and renewed questions about different priorities and who lives matter most in global resource allocation. Looking forward to 2023, I would hope that the current opportunity for reflection on these legacies of COVID-19 will catalyze political will for wider reforms. Dr. Tedros, Director General of the WHO, has spoken frequently of the need for global solidarity, and such hope is concretized in the current process of developing a pandemic treaty or framework under the auspices of the WHO. And this year now will be a critical year for this process. It provides some optimism that new mechanisms might emerge that strengthen the global health architectures and the hand of WHO by giving teeth to enforcements, addressing governance challenges, and the tensions between global common good and other interests. So finally, then, what would I see as priorities for wider change over 2023 and beyond in health? Firstly, system strengthening. And there does seem to be some impetus, at least to the idea, to invest in health systems across preventative and curative care. Second, the old issue of universal health coverage. In some contexts, there's evidence of political will to reform national health systems to provide population-level health financing. But of course, there are also examples where such systems are under severe strain or being actively undermined. Third, reforms for equity and justice, and the pandemic treaty process provides some optimism for reform of international mechanisms for improving equity, and also hopefully process for greater adaptation of responses to health emergencies in the face of differing regional priorities and contexts. And finally, let us hope that we might see a concerted impetus towards shifting power in global health in 2023. Thank you.
Hayley, thank you very much indeed. That was wonderful. So finally, let's turn to a really important topic around climate and environmental justice. So Shilpi, over to you.
Thanks.
What's ahead this year?
Well, I'll try my best to do some predictions here. Thanks, Melissa. My intervention actually builds on a lot of stuff that speakers have already shared, but specifically, I'm going to look at the intersection of some of these challenges that have been outlined with climate issues, because we all know that in many contexts, climate change is acting as a stress multiplier. The last few years clearly demonstrate that we've entered a phase of radical climatic uncertainty, where the past is no longer a good guide for what we need to do for the future. From a climate perspective, this is replete in the experience of 2022, where many records were broken across the globe, be it in the heat waves that we experienced in Europe or South Asia, the floods in Pakistan, and droughts in many parts of Africa. This is the new normal of our global climate system as it becomes more variable and volatile. We cannot continue with more of the same or what we've been doing in the past, because if we do that, in most cases, this will not work. And worse, it'll create multiple forms of injustice and maladaptive outcomes. Climate change is fundamentally a question of justice. Those least responsible for climate change are having to bear unequal and disproportionate burdens of the impacts, and in many cases of the solutions as well. These impacts are exacerbated by structural injustices driven by race, class, caste, ethnicity, gender, and ability, and so on. From our research within the cluster across various projects, we know that climate injustices come from daily stressors, be it with regards to ongoing drought or lack of basic services around water, sanitation, and health, and other structural vulnerabilities, which other speakers have also spoken about. But these don't appear so frequently in headlines. For instance, in the Anticipate project, where we are studying the social and structural drivers of hydrological extremes, such as droughts and floods, we've observed that the effects of these extreme events are actually compounded by poverty and lack of basic services, especially around water, which is to do with water contamination and health services. Shocks capture attention, but it's the everyday precarity driven by systemic inequalities that are at the heart of climate injustice. In this sense, sometimes the crisis or the emergency framings can potentially block out the plural ways and the lived experiences of people and how they are navigating these uncertainties and also dealing with them, and push for one-size-fits-all solutions. These are problematic on many grounds. For instance, we are also witnessing that some of the so-called climate solutions are perpetuating these very systems of inequity and injustice in the form of displacement and land grabs when it comes to green energy solutions, or the homogenizing narrative around climate and livestock. In many places, these frontline communities are now paying the price for climate solutions or the transitions that we are talking about. So where do we go from here, and what do I think about 2023 against this bleak backdrop? I think we are gravitating towards a moment of rupture. And here I want to borrow from Sango Mohanty's work on rupture, which is about dislocations between society and nature relationships, as well as our own work in the Tapestry project about uncertainty and its relationship with transformation. Ruptures or uncertainties can be potentially destabilizing, and that is what we are seeing across the world. But hopefully they can also be generative and can catalyze change. 2023 has some high-profile events: COP28, the Climate Ambition Summit, called by the UN Secretary General after the frustrating results around mitigation, as well as the UN Water Conference, which is happening in March. All these events highlight the intersecting nature of climate change and touch upon its intersection with key areas like water, sanitation, health, etc. And therefore, moving beyond a siloed approach and looking at links between adaptation and adaptation and mitigation on one hand, and secondly, links between climate and how it intersects with other key sectors such as water, food, etc., would be key. However, we also have other agendas being squeezed in under the garb of climate change solutions, which are nothing short of greenwashing. And there was all this controversy around the UN around the COP28 presidency, as we all know. So one needs to be wary about how far these events will move the needle on some of these critical issues, especially around decarbonization and mitigation and what shape it would take. In terms of catalysts, I'm hopeful on two grounds. One is about the progress of loss and damage. That was a positive way to end 2022. But the battle is far from being won. We all know that because we don't know how this will be made workable, what kind of financial systems would be put in place, and whether these solutions or pathways that we'll come up with will be just and fair and inclusive. We need to continue to watch this space. Another catalyst for me is the bottom-up solidarities and coalitions that are forming in diverse spheres, in diverse spaces, and with more and more young people getting involved. Their message is also clear. We don't want more of the same. But of course, there is backlash, there are protests, and there are issues of shrinking civic spaces, which Shandana has also touched upon. So that is the tension and contradiction that we have to deal with. Embracing the uncertainties or the radical uncertainty will require opening up to diverse voices, knowledges, and perspectives in many spaces and places. It also means that we radically need to decolonize how we think about climate change and its solutions, and reversing the gaze in terms of thinking about solutions and the ideas of justice, because it's principally about centering the voices and experiences of those people who are on the margins, on the front line, and it is their visions and futures that count. So we're not working towards a singular future, but multiple futures, and we have to accommodate and be open to that. So in that spirit, despite all the bleak and doom and gloom scenario, I want to remain cautiously optimistic. Thank you.
Well, look, I think a clap to our panel members, because that was a great... reflections, provocations, predictions. Some optimism there in bleak and uncertain times. But I'm going to turn now to Peter. Peter, what did you make of that? And where can you find some dilemmas, but also perhaps some seeds of hope in what we've just heard?
Well, lots of dilemmas. And I think also some seeds of hope. I mean, first of all, let me say thanks to all of our panelists. I'm always inspired listening to my colleagues. And I think at IDS, you're going to hear what's bleak and gloomy, but we're also going to hear where there's seeds of hope and alternative possibilities for the future. To what extent do I feel optimistic about whether we'll make progress on development? Well, of course, optimism is shaped inevitably by where you're positioned in any context or at any given time. I can only give a personal view, but it's shaped by the challenges and the opportunities that we've heard about today. I think there are grounds for optimism. For example, we're seeing communities as the central drivers in finding concrete ways to understand and act upon many challenges that we've heard about of climate change. They're finding collective ways to respond to multiple intersecting crises, whether those are related to environment, energy, health, conflict, food, authoritarianism, political polarization, or a range of other inequalities. I think my colleagues have indicated, and we know from many other examples of evidence, that citizens themselves are finding novel, innovative, and cooperative ways to engage with government and policy actors, with different groups of actors, reaching conclusions that to move forward, they need to work together. And also, we've seen that major global events, again, as we just heard, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, even though they bring really unimaginable negative impacts, are also generating opportunities to address those deep structural inequities and to shift prevailing power imbalances and to support greater solidarity, preparedness, resilience for the inevitability of future crises, but also forging commitment to strengthening systems and institutions. But we can't ignore those many extraordinary challenges that we just heard from the panel. We know there's backtracking against climate action, backlash against gender justice, constraints to achieving rights of many kinds, widening and deepening poverty, indebtedness, diminishing trust in institutions, surveillance and misinformation through the use of digital technologies, the continuation of conflict, and a whole variety of tools of oppression which lead to authoritarianism, political polarization, a whittling away of democracy, a rise in inequalities, and the displacement of millions of people around the globe. So in terms of recasting development, which is the title of this session, what would bring hope? And we've heard today that there are some really urgent issues that need to be addressed. And it's hard to imagine that we can tackle these challenges together without some significant shifts in what we call development, practice, and thinking. And evidence suggests that there are some cross-cutting integrative actions which are needed. So, for example, it's really important to catalyze engagement with citizens, state and non-state actors around justice, rights, empowerment, and accountability in order to address those intersecting inequalities that we've heard about. We also need much better integration and mutual learning between foreign policy, social policy, and development approaches grounded in the aspirations, the needs, and the realities of citizens and communities. So at IDS, with our partners and collaborators, we've been having a conversation around what we've called recasting of development. And with a vision of transforming knowledge and transforming lives, we believe at IDS really fundamentally in the need for a commitment to complementary combinations of research, education, and engagement, involving collaborations and cooperation between natural and social sciences and humanities, and with different actors of many different kinds: policymakers, businesses, funders, practitioners, advocates, activists, citizens, and the different intermediaries who help to forge connections between all of these groups. And we believe that all of this needs to be underpinned by a commitment to co-creation of knowledge, to championing of evidence, to equitable partnerships and mutual learning between countries, and engagement between research, policy, and practice communities. We've heard fortunately, some really concrete examples today of ways in which some progress is being made towards addressing these challenges. But we also heard of many challenges where progress can become slow, it can stop, and in some cases it can even be in reverse. And we're going to hear more and more about this globally as we arrive at the midpoint of the journey towards the SDGs by 2030. And we know there is already hand-wringing, recriminations, but hopefully also commitments to action, which are informed by those whose lives are most affected, and all of which, again, as we've heard just now, is supported by political will. So we have to keep going, and we have to keep trying. We have to embrace uncertainty. We accept the road ahead will be unpredictable, and it's often going to be very uncomfortable for all of us. So more than ever, we need allies, we need fellow travelers, and by moving together, we may at times go more slowly, but we can go further together in our efforts to tackle collectively the structural challenges and power imbalances that we've just been hearing about. Now, I want to be optimistic. Sometimes that's not easy, but when I observe the amazing determination, commitment, and honestly courage of so many development actors around the world, including our colleagues, all of those who are in this room, and many, many others around the world, it provides me and others listening today, I hope, also for you, a sense of hope that a different future is possible.
Peter, thank you very much indeed. So you've heard a set of reflections, set of possibilities, some worries, some bleak aspects, some grounds for hope. Now it's over to you. So we've got a big online audience and we've got all of you in the room. And open up, I'll take a round of questions. It could be a question to one of the panelists or something more general, but do state if it's to somebody in particular. And we'll take some from the room and then some from the online audience, and then I'll go back to the panel and then we'll have another round of responses. So I'm seeing one over here from James to begin, and then down here.
Hi, I'm James Georgilakis from IDS. I guess it's my question's mainly for Shandana, but anyone can answer. I'm so fascinated by this kind of slide to authoritarianism, and I just wanted to know whether the research agenda often seems to focus on the villains. So, you know, what is it they're doing to manipulate social media? What are they doing to control power and to mislead people? But I'm also fascinated by the kind of the level to which this is happening via the ballot box. And you know, I would be really interested to know whether we can explore a bit more of that end of it. Why has the progressive left failed so spectacularly in so many different political contexts? And what's driving that? And you know, it's long been noted that people will vote against their best self-interests, and this has been a pattern we've seen historically ever since the birth of democracy. And George Lakoff, talking about North American politics, noted this in particular. You know, the entire Republican Party is supported by the relatively poor people of the American Midwest who don't have any health insurance. So, what is going on there? And is there a problem with us? With the progressive left? Why do we fail to deliver the kind of evidence and the kind of argument and framing which can capture the hearts and minds of people as effectively as the authoritarians, the conservatives and the right? Thank you.
Great question. Okay, so I'll come now to in the center here.
Hi, I'm Bharat. I'm from Anabel. So my question is a bit similar to what been asked before, more on the political participation. So we're talking about people are voting for autocracy and how do we counter this? So is it a approach, let's say, having a compulsory voting across the, compulsory voting in a country? Because I'm also talking in the context of India, where there's a discussion of having one election in the entire country. So having a compulsory voting does help, reducing the polarization, maybe, and all that. So.
Good. Let's just move across to you.
Hi, thank you so much to all of you. This is a question that is from what Vidya was talking about, where they mentioned that poverty, I mean like income poverty, I think, is an insufficient lens. And we also need to think about the conceptions of human safety. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit? Thank you.
Okay, great. To Martin, is there?
I guess for all of the panelists, what do you see as the role for global institutions, global political institutions in the challenges that you've discussed? It kind of feels like we could be quite pessimistic in terms of, did global institutions help deal with help deliver vaccines? No, they failed. Are they going to resolve climate change in time? No, probably not. Have they helped deal with the problem of authoritarianism? Frequently not. So can you give us any hope for optimism in that area?
Great. I wonder, Gary, do we have any questions from the online audience? I might just take a couple.
Yes. The pandemic showed a lot of disparities between developed and the developing world. Firstly, inequality in vaccine access. Secondly, ability of countries to manage the crisis better, relief packages. Thirdly, the ability of the economies to bounce back. This was expected, but how does recasting development contribute to prepare for future pandemics or disasters, especially in the developing world? One more.
Great, and maybe one more if people have got some notes of these. Yeah.
I would be curious to hear panelists' perspectives on what work is most urgent in the area of internet, tech governance and tech justice rights, given the growing understanding that these issues cut across each other.
Right. Okay. Good. Well, that's a really great set of questions. So I'll go back to our panel in order. There were some that were directed at you in particular, and bet you might also respond to those general ones as well, particularly about global institutions and about the tech world, which is of course relevant to all of these areas. So Vidya, maybe you first.
Thank you, Melissa. And thanks for the questions as well. I'll begin with the question on income poverty and dimensions of human safety that might be relevant to this. And I think in terms of income poverty itself, there's a large and increasing recognition about the importance of other aspects such as multidimensional deprivations, whether through the global multidimensional poverty index or more holistic measures of what it means to live in poverty as well, such as one example is the Swedish SIDA's framework on multidimensional poverty, which in it's a donut approach, which at its core focuses on understanding access to resources, people's opportunity and choice, and so forth. But then in the outer circle focuses on context of the why of why people are in poverty, so political context, conflict, and so forth. And I think a multidimensional conception of poverty is quite relevant to embed human security in, because it draws attention to people's capabilities, to borrow sense language, in terms of and the constraints that human insecurity might pose to people's doings and beings, essentially. So I think a more holistic conception of what it means to be poor in different contexts is certainly one that's worth exploring in more detail. I'll perhaps just address another question as well around the preparedness component. And I think something that we saw that we're seeing through responses to multiple crises is examples of early warning systems being operationalized in many cases more effectively. And I think this is also one way in which to mitigate or to deal with these contexts of uncertainty. Many institutions, for example, are lowering what their thresholds previously were, say for implementing flood warning actions and so forth. So I think there's a lot of work from anticipatory action, the space of anticipatory action that can also offer learning amidst contexts of uncertainty and insecurity.
Shandana, there was quite a lot in there about politics and governance.
And because of that, I'm going to be really brief while acknowledging that the answers are fairly complex. But James, your concern is exactly what mine is. I always say I'm not interested in what political leaders are doing. I'm far more interested in what voters are doing, because none of these guys are coming in through coups. Again, some have, but they're coming in through the ballot box, and they're coming in through regular electoral politics. So clearly that whatever they have to say is appealing to voters. And what we have to understand is why it's appealing to voters. And to just try and draw some of those linkages while acknowledging that we still have to understand a lot of that, is that we're clearly, the progressive left is not capturing imaginations in the same way. And a lot of that may actually be connected to what we've been talking about here as the age of uncertainty. And when you have polycrises, when you're dealing with one crisis after another with a lot of uncertainty, you need some kind of clear explanations. And what the other side, it's on the right, it's populist, there's a lot of adjectives that have been used for it. But the side that is leading to this autocratization, what they've been able to do is provide a lot of certainty within that. There is an enemy. There are people to blame. There are things that are causing this. There's immigrants who come and take your jobs. There are people working against your country. There are anti-nationals. There's a lot of narrative that has been created. And then, of course, digital technologies that spreads that and that allows a spread that we've not seen before. And in the same way, the progressive left is playing within a system that's not being questioned, of capitalism, of inequality, of what are the answers. And so I'm not suggesting that we take on sort of the same kind of a narrative building. But at the same time, what is it that can take apart that narrative more decisively? And that's something that the progressive left has not managed to do. But in there is also a role of the media. When there are people who do that, does the media actually project that in exactly the same way? And does the story sell in exactly the same way? So connected to that, Bharat, is the answer to your question as well. Clearly, we need more people to come out. But why are those people not coming out? So if compulsory voting is just going to bring out more votes for the same groups, because you'd imagine that by now the threat is large enough for people to come out and vote without compulsory voting being a part of that mix. So we don't know if compulsory voting brings out more of the same votes or not, but clearly within that, a lot of reforms have been suggested. For example, also moving from first past the post systems to PR systems in countries like the UK, in India, right? And so a few different reforms are on that table. And Martin, I'm going to pass this question on to others, but very quickly to say global institutions come out of these same national institutions and national politics, and countries play those politics at the global level. And we're not, and you're absolutely right, on the floods, on climate change, on vaccines, we haven't reimagined this at the global level either. We're still working within the same capitalist system that leads to this inequality in the first place. So you're right, the global institutions are not providing the leadership that we might expect.
Okay, thank you. Well, first to the question about the left, it wasn't to me, but I wanted to respond because actually, based on the experience of the work I have done, particularly in South America over the last years, I just realized that the main problem we have at the moment is precisely that the left is not responding. And that has to do a lot with how slow they are moving from addressing issues of distributive justice to more taking into account issues of procedural justice. And by that, I mean, they have been very slow in really starting to engage with citizens and the demands of citizens in terms of, for example, how, in the area I work, for example, how to organize productive activities, everything related to large investment projects and so on. They are acting as if the main problem is about once decisions are taken in the top level about how you distribute and dealing with issues of distributing profits and incomes. But what I have been observing in South America over the last years is that people is asking something else, and the left wing is really slow in delivering this new what the people is demanding now. So yeah, that is regarding to the first question, but a reflection of somebody that is working in a different area, but I think is really the main challenge we are facing. In terms of the question about global institutions, I completely agree that they are failing to deliver. I'm very concerned about actually the role they are playing. On the one hand, because of what just Shandana said, but if we go more specifically about the kind of things that they are working with, my concern is that at the end of the day, they never deal with what I mentioned are the key elements in the system that are the ones that are keeping feeding or keeping alive the main problems that we face. So for example, with the whole issue of the pandemic and the responses to the pandemic, they never managed to deal with the main problem we face that has to do with property rights, exclusionary rights, and all these issues that were the real challenge that countries that were trying to face or develop their own policies and approaches to face the pandemic could not access knowledge, could not access existing data. And so they were at the center of the problem of unequal distribution of, for example, the vaccines, but these global institutions did not deal with this problem at all. And this relates to the other question that was from the people that is not in the room, that is about what we learn from that, particularly in terms of the possibilities of less developing countries to face crises like the one we face with the COVID. And in my view, one of the main learnings, looking at the evidence of what happened with the COVID, is that a lot of the discussion many times about these are focused and still now are focused about knowledge production, scientific knowledge production, and so on, which is important. But at the end, at least for many of the countries that face difficulties, not so much to face the problems of the pandemic. It was not so much about the lack of availability of scientific knowledge. It was much more about how to profit from this knowledge, because the system put much more barriers in terms of capacities of profits and use this knowledge to produce and deliver solutions than to produce and access the knowledge on a scientific arena. So in my view, this is the main challenge looking at the future, is how we really enable and think about distributed capacities across countries in terms of capacities to exploit or profit or use, whatever term we want to use, the knowledge that has already been produced outside the countries or even within the countries. And I leave it here.
I think it's Hayley now.
Hayley.
I think we'll go next to Hayley.
Hi, I'm going to particularly take on Martin's question, where you were asking, I think, what are the sort of, you were pointing to the challenges for global institutions, and you were kind of asking, is there a sign for hope? And I think certainly if I look at the sort of pandemic treaty process, I think certainly in global health, there is always a lot of goodwill. People's working in global institutions, their instincts are often strong. There's this sort of strong urge towards equity, solidarity, and there's a lot of talk. One hears there's a lot now from WHO. I think the difficulty is that given the kind of lack of interdisciplinarity often in global health and people's kind of trainings, that the challenge is always that, for example, the framings of pandemic preparedness, even if one reads the sort of documents around the treaty, they always tend to the more technical, the sort of the quick fix, the technological. So even though one has this language, for example, of the importance of trust, the way that then plays out is often in quite a sort of a technical way about needing to give people the right information, for example, through better infodemic management. And I think the other sort of problem is actually which also comes, I think, from this lack of interdisciplinarity often is really what Anabel was pointing to, that often biomedical research kind of stops at that point of, sharing viral genomes or sort of open science. And there are not that many people in global health that sort of go behind and do this other level of work, looking at these processes, and particularly some of the vested interests that Anabel was pointing to. And I think, just looking at, for example, the aims of a pandemic treaty that should really be giving us hope. And one of the aims is to sort of try and address some of these governance challenges and the failures that we saw in the pandemic. But of course, we know that these are really complex. And I think often I would say there's sort of some naivety, partly because of people's own disciplinary trainings, because these are really difficult issues to address. For example, we've seen with mpox that, what might seem a public health event of international concern if one's in Europe or the UK and this outbreak is happening, might be viewed very differently, for example, in West Africa. And I don't see much effort to really address those differences between member states and how these different priorities, what they mean for global investments. And that gets me to the question that somebody asked, very good question, and I think we should be really addressing it. How does recasting development help here? And interestingly, in the treaty process, there's a lot of talk, all this language that possibly those of us who work in development more widely have been familiar with for a long time, but I think it's quite novel in global health, all of government responses, whole of society approach. And one of the online questions was asking, well, we've seen the importance, for example, of social protection mechanisms and so forth. And I think finally that idea is really sinking in, and this sort of emphasis on the need for longer term investments, not just quick fixes, investments not only in the sort of technical elements of surveillance and response, but also in building up these interconnections between health systems and other kinds of systems such as social protection. And I think that also really the recasting that I think is so important is this sort of across sectors, but also the universal nature of these challenges. And I think there is more awareness of that. And the fact, we hear from WHO oh, all the time, we're in this together, we're not safe until all are safe. And hopefully the pandemic has really brought that home, and that might provide impetus to address some of these sort of more intractable challenges, governance, power relations, and so forth. But I know I'm also sounding possibly too optimistic, but I think there is some cause for hope.
Shilpi.
Thanks. I'll keep my responses very brief. I wanted to respond to Martin's question on global institutions. So from a climate perspective, I think global institutions are indeed failing. And the reason is quite similar to what Shandana has pointed out, because they reproduce power inequality between the global north and south. So the kind of solutions that are proposed do not always work. And also it's an issue around the historic burden, and that has been quite controversial, as we've seen with the whole idea of watering down the language of loss and damage and people pushing back, and countries of the global south, along with activists pushing back. So there is that tension, and that tension is very alive in climate change. The other issue that I think is really important is the non-binding nature of whatever, I mean, there are no treaties as such which are binding. And also, if you look at the whole COP process, we have outcomes, but what is the process that is actually going to implement it? Or how are nations going to build this whole framework together? Who's going to put in the finances? And these questions are never answered through the COP process. And ultimately, I feel that it's really important to not forget the national and the subnational here, because global processes inadvertently are worked out by national actors, and they are watered down along the way. So it's also the tension between the global and the national, and what is projected at the global sometimes is lip service, which India has done very well on net zero, and what it's implementing is just the opposite in terms of exclusionary practices and injustices and dispossession that are going on in the country in the name of climate mitigation. In terms of recasting development, I wanted to take on the question on disaster preparedness. From a very mainstream perspective, I think disaster framework has not taken into account uncertainty. It's very oriented towards risk reduction. And it is based on the premise that we can know what is going to happen. And what uncertainty is suggesting is we cannot know what is going to happen. There are limits to anticipation now, given the era of radical uncertainty that we are living in. And therefore, the whole preparedness paradigm has to pivot away from the kind of anticipation to navigating uncertainties. And that would really require relying on plural knowledges, which we don't do. It's mostly technocentric interventions. Early warning systems are able to actually account for warnings and then prevent loss of life. But the long-term changes and the stressors that we've been talking about are not accounted for. And that is why many of us at IDS have been asking questions around who are we asking to prepare, and in what ways, and do they have the capacity to prepare in the ways top-down responses on preparedness are asking communities to prepare for. Thank you.
Looking at the time, I think we could probably have a really quick round. We might take 4 short questions, and then I'm going to come back to the panel, and I want your final 1-minute response and look to the future. So if I have the microphone. Go to Lila there. Or yeah, let's see.
My question is for Shilpi. So regarding the climate change, I wanted to ask the intersection of the violence and the conflict in the recent years, especially with the Ukraine crisis. We are opening up the mines in this country again, and climate.
We can't hear very well.
My question is for Shilpi. In the current context, I just wanted to know its intersection with the conflicts and violence. As with the Ukraine crisis, we are reopening mines in the country. In the other parts as well, climate change is affecting, in many sorts, not only wars, but other forms of conflict within the indigenous perspectives as well. So what do you think will be new development in this sector? And do you see any resolution, any better policies for it?
Great. Is there another one in the room? Short question.
Yeah, that was, can you hear me? That was
Yes.
a really exciting panel. Thank you. Just very quick questions for everybody. So on authoritarianism, I guess the left is very nuanced, right? whereas the right has very simple messages, demonizes, simplifies. So does the left need to resort to some of that, and how? On the pandemic, I mean, Hayley, I think one thing that the pandemic has done is also normalized disease, health burden, and you have the whole issue of long COVID and all sorts of knock-ons, and somehow that has not really been taken very seriously. So what do you make of that? And how do you also bring in the social science perspectives about some of these lived experiences of disease that are often rubbished by the practitioners? And Shilpi and Vidya, I guess, a lot of what IDS does is we focus on multidimensional perspectives of poverty, of climate, of lived experiences, of justice. But how about flipping that lens? And I didn't hear either of you actually talk about capitalism or about, the rich, the wealthy, the actual how do we go after them more now in 2023 and beyond?
Great. And Gary, there's one more from our online audience.
So I'd like to hear the panelists' thoughts on how we cope or reduce the inequality gap. Basically,
Okay, that's a big one. Right, more big questions, but I'm now going to go along the panel again, and I want literally a minute, which could be a quick response and then a final thought for the next year. What should we really be focusing on? So, Vidya.
Great, thank you. In terms of reducing the inequality gap, I suppose there are inequalities along various dimensions, sectoral, horizontal, various vertical, and so on. So I think a more holistic conceptualization of what it means to, what types of inequalities and grounding that in any response is quite important. In terms of the rich and capitalist focus, absolutely. And I think here's where multi-scalar analysis is quite critical, whether speaking of poverty or inequality. And quite central to poverty discourse is power, concerns of power and who holds the power in decision-making, and whether at intra-household levels up to states levels and in the multilateral system, and how that affects, trickles or doesn't trickle down. So I suppose in terms of looking forward to 2022, the year that we are in, it's just bringing it back to that focus on addressing uncertainty, and it won't necessarily come through just one sector. It won't necessarily come through focusing on one group alone, but it needs to be embedded in a much more holistic representation of what it means to be in poverty, marginalized or deprived, and treating that in its whole.
Laila, sure, absolutely. We do need to simplify it. And if I was to try and write that for them, let's simplify around redistribution and make that the one conversation that any progressive group has. And, and maybe that's where the simplicity lies on the other side. And connected to that, one positive sort of thought going forward is the whole issue of autocratization looks really big, but where it actually unravels is inside our homes and in our classrooms and in our neighborhoods, because at the end of the day, those are the people that are voting, and that's where those decisions are made. And there's good work that happened in the years that associations lived under Trump, and in the years that they came up to the election of last year, a while ago now, that there was a lot of a sense of organizing at the local level to understand why people voted for Trump. And similarly, those are questions that we can ask in very local associations and in our classrooms to figure out what's that simple narrative, what flips the vote for in every country that we've just discussed here.
Okay, I go back to the same, because I think probably, yes, of course, one of the challenges is the need of simplification, but I think one of the main problems has been this focus on redistribution, at least in South America. That's what I know more, and because it has really missed the point that with people not much more informed and connected now and more empowered as well, then the demand is different. And in a context like many of the South American countries, with different visions and cosmovisions about how to use, for example, common resources, or what it means really in improvement in the quality of life, the whole narrative about redistribution is not working anymore. And this is one of the main reasons why many of the traditional left-wing parties are really losing space, and we are desperate for new kinds of narratives and ideas. And then just, I have time? No.
Do we want to go to Hayley first?
Do you have a final response and a last word for us?
Yeah, Lila quite characteristically has, of course, raised an issue that I can't summarize in 1 minute, so maybe a further discussion. But what I will say is, Lila, I think the normalization question is quite complex, but I think what the pandemic has shown is that the vulnerabilities were really shaped by structural factors, histories and experiences, and how that comes to bear in sort of the embodied experience of illness. And I think you're right, in these sort of emergency moments, the focus is always on the acute and that challenge. But of course, even in that moment of the acute, COVID in this very interesting way demonstrated that these divisions, for example, between infectious and non-communicable disease just had to fall away, because some of those biological vulnerabilities were related to comorbidities that in turn were shaped by histories and structural factors. And I think what's interesting now is we see something like long COVID and that sort of experience also of chronic ill health related to an experience of infection. In my own work, I see so many parallels to social science work on living with HIV as a chronic illness and how that transition happened. And again, I think the lesson there is there's no biomedical quick fixes. It's really about sort of longer term systems changes. And that is really to try and orientate systems to enable them to care. And I think that would be my sort of final comment on what you've been saying. I think we need social science perspectives to come to the fore more, but also perspectives from humanities. And I think what I've really seen is the importance also of ethics and research in ethics to really unpack some of these issues around care. I mean, one of the big things is the way in which vulnerability was defined, how it became evident, how it was dealt with in different contexts, how were resources allocated, tensions between the collective and the individual, and these real questions about care. And I think those will also need to be addressed better in future pandemics. We need to do deliberation to really get a sense of how people want those questions answered, so that we don't leave them to acute medics to sort of make these decisions in crisis. And in that regard, I think, again, systems building, I mean, in order to really bring in people's experiences, their embodied experiences of ill health, and to sort of challenge more dominant biomedical narratives, we really need systems that can care and listen. And I think, as we know, those are really under severe strain in this country and beyond.
Thanks, Hayley. Shilpi.
Very quickly, so just responding to Lila's comments on capitalism and climate change, absolutely, Lila, with you on that. And I think capitalism is really at the heart of some of the climate change challenges that we are facing, not just globally, but also locally, what communities are facing in terms of dispossession, displacement, increased vulnerabilities because they've lost access. So absolutely, I think that is incredibly important. That is part of the structural vulnerability that we were talking about, and why it's really important not to actually critically analyze greenwashing and market-based solutions that's going on and on across these global platforms. So it's really important that there is a pushback. Just very quickly on climate and conflict, there are two quick points that I want to make. One is about climate change as such and the attribution. I think we really need to also be wary that everything gets lumped up into climate change and there is no accountability whatsoever. Everything is happening. We need to do this. We need to open more minds because climate change, because gas crisis. And I think these narratives are problematic and we need to push back on that. In terms of local conflicts around mining, I think this is the issue that I was raising around just transitions and how these transitions happen. And there are very interesting and powerful narratives now coming out on communities being trained as paralegals and how they are using discourses of justice, rights, and using public interest litigations, for instance, to claim those spaces. So that is a very positive movement. Sorry, I didn't say much about 2023.
No, that's great. So, Peter, final word from you?
Yes, just very quickly. Actually, earlier today, we had an interesting question about history. Hayley just alluded to that. We often imagine ourselves, I guess, at a particular moment in time, trying to interpret where we are now and what the future is likely to be. In fact, we're a product of our histories. Everything we experience today has been shaped and influenced by what has gone before. So, understanding how trajectories in the past have led to the kinds of transformations and changes we're experiencing now is so important. And if we don't look back to that history, we're just missing opportunities to learn how different people's experiences have evolved, including our own over time, and understanding how we place ourselves in that context of a longer history. Looking forward, I think that can also help us with the evidence that we generate today and the knowledge which is co-created through collaboration and partnership in understanding alternative futures. And, I think recasting development can give us ways of thinking about directions for the future, which may not be as we predict at the moment, using foresight, using the power of technologies, which can constrain and can inhibit, but can also offer opportunities to facilitate change in positive directions, good change, as Robert would say. So I think that's learning from history and using the tools that are emerging today to collectively and inclusively imagine together alternative futures that we can work towards.
Fantastic. So that leads me to where I wanted to conclude, which is in fact 4 A's. One of them is an A we have not heard. Hasn't it been striking how aid has barely been mentioned? And I think that's really interesting in this discussion after a year when so many of us and many people in development were preoccupied with the aid cuts, the drops in aid budgets, and so on. And this is not to say that aid and aid programs are not important, but I think what we've heard today is that development is so much more than that. It's well beyond aid and outside aid, and it affects everybody everywhere. And it is fundamentally about change, good change, as Robert would put it. So the aid word hasn't been there. The other ones I really wanted to pick up on were alternatives. I think this is a year ahead where we have to think really hard and work with others to challenge power relations and politics and identify those alternatives and find ways to support them. That means another A, which is alliances. We've been talking a lot in this session about the local, the national, the global, but actually some of those transnational, translocal alliances where people who share common progressive concerns across countries, between movements, may be some of the sources for optimism and hope. Maybe this is the year when we really need to watch the alliances as well as watching some of the other things we've been looking at. And I think my final A would be ambition. If there's one source for optimism, it's that there are many people in the world, and quite a lot of them are in this room and online, who really share a conviction that things can be different and need to be different. So let's have a message of ambition for this next year, and may we all continue to work together for the transformations that I think many people feel are so important. So a final big clap for our panel, and thank you to our audience.